Well, I had the unenviable job of following that. Fortunately, it's not directly my job because we're going to hear the Word of God, and that's probably the only thing that could top that. We're going to be reading 1 Peter chapter 4, 1 through 11. For those of you who are first-time guests with us today, we're in the midst of a sermon series on 1 Peter, entitled Living Hope for a Dying World. So let's listen to God's Word. Since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same intention. For whoever has suffered in the flesh has finished with sin, so as to live for the rest of your earthly life, no longer by human desires, but rather by the will of God. Now, you've already spent enough time in doing what the Gentiles like to do, living in licentiousness and passions and drunkenness, revels, carousing, and lawless idolatry. They're surprised that you no longer join them in the same excess of dissipation, and so they blaspheme. They will have to give an accounting to him who stands ready to judge the living and the dead. And my tablet is frozen. Yeah, it happens.
It's on the screen.
It's on the screen. Well, I know, but I got the sermon thing on here too. We're going to try this one more time. Life. Okay. For this reason the gospel is proclaimed even to the dead, so that though they have been judged in the flesh, as everyone is judged, they might live in the spirit as God does. Now, the end of all things is near. Therefore be serious and discipline yourselves for the sake of your prayers. Above all, maintain constant love for one another, for love covers a multitude of sins. Be hospitable to one another, without complaining. Like good stewards of the manifold grace of God, serve one another with whatever gift each of you has received. Whoever speaks must do so as one speaking the very words of God. Whoever serves must do so with the strength that God supplies, so that God may be glorified in all things through Jesus Christ. To him belong the glory and the power forever and ever. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Well, life is short, and then you die. I know that's a heck of a way to begin a sermon, but it's going to get better, I promise you. Besides, on this Memorial Day weekend, this truth of the finality of life ought to be close to us, something that we're all attuned to. I'll never forget the first day that I experienced death firsthand. I was a busy 17-year-old living in Denver, Colorado. As I was rushing out the door, I called out to my father saying, "See you, Dad?" And there was no answer. I wandered into his bedroom and I said, "Dad, you okay?" And there was no answer. And there he was, breathing irregularly on the bed. I called 911, I began mouth to mouth, but it was all too late, and my father indeed passed away that day. That experience of death changed me forever at an early age in life. You cannot taste death, literally, and not be changed. Life is short, and we die. Fyodor Dostoevsky learned this when he was 29 years of age. On November 16, 1849, Dostoevsky was dragged before a firing squad for being a political subversive. He was blindfolded, ordered to make his confessions, to say his prayers, and to wait for the bullets to pierce his heart. He heard the officer telling the soldiers to get ready to fire. He heard the order to fire. He heard the guns go off even, but he felt nothing. The bullets were blanks. The Tsar had brought young Dostoevsky to the brink of death to prove that Dostoevsky's life was not his own. In retrospect, the author considered what happened that day one of the best things that could have ever happened to anyone. To go through the mental process, the preparation of death, without actually dying, allowed Dostoevsky to appreciate life in a fullness of dimension he had never pondered before. Who knows, without Dostoevsky's near-death experience, the brothers Karamazov, Crime and Punishment, so many of his writings would probably have never been written. Life is short, and then we die. So therefore, dear friends, embrace life. Live it to the fullest. One senses this urgency running through 1 Peter chapter 4. As Peter is wrapping up his letter to the Christians in Asia Minor, he wants to remind them that time is short and that they don't have any time to waste. He begins in verse 1 reminding them that Christ suffered in the flesh and that they will also suffer in the flesh. So, he says, live the rest of your earthly lives not by your human desires, but rather by the will of God. Don't waste your life, says Peter. Live a life that matters. Live according to God's will and plan and purpose. We've already wasted enough time living the way non-Christians do, he says in verse 3. We've wasted too much of our time drinking and partying on religious idolatry, he says. Now, lists of vices like this that we have in this section of 1 Peter are pretty common in the New Testament. So the point isn't so much the particular sins that the audience had or had not done, but rather that all of us have wasted too much time doing things that quite honestly just don't cut it when it comes to the light of eternity. Maybe they aren't things that are bad at all. They're not sinful necessarily, but maybe they're just things that are plain unimportant. I remember talking to my father-in-law, Jack, as he was dying of cancer, and I asked him, I said, if you could do it all again, what might you do differently? His answer really surprised me. He said, Bill, he said, if I could do it all again, I wouldn't spend nearly so much time fixing up houses. I kind of did a double take and said, I don't understand. He said, every time we would move, I would go all out and I would fix up the house. I would repaint it. I would add on rooms to it. I would redo the electrical and the plumbing and all of that stuff. And then he said, you know what would happen, Bill? Then we would move again and we would sell it to somebody else, and all of that work was completely wasted. If I could do it again, he said, I wouldn't spend so much time worrying about my house. I'm so grateful that my father-in-law lived a life that was worth living, and I'm grateful that he passed on his wisdom before he left this earth. We've all, the truth is, wasted too much time already, goofing around on the internet, buffing our cars, working too many hours, watching too much television, building our houses, drinking our beers, wasting time on things that aren't necessarily bad, but aren't necessarily worthy of the priority that we invest in them either. So let's live the rest of our earthly lives, not by our human desires, but by God's. The end of all things is near, Peter says in verse 7. So be serious and discipline yourselves for the sake of your prayers. Or to put it more bluntly, grow up and get to work. But what does a growing up, a disciplined life centered on God's will look like? Well, that's what the second part of this text is about. Love one another, we read in verse 8. Be hospitable to one another, verse 9. Serve one another, verse 10. That is 3 one another's in a row. A life worth living is not centered on self, but on one another. Centered on a community, and in particular, a community of faith. So I want to break that down just a little bit further. 4:8 says, above all, maintain constant love for one another, for love covers a multitude of sins. Three things strike me in Peter's section here. The first is the idea that love is maintained. Now, maintenance isn't really a very romantic or sexy word, is it, when we think about love? But love, he says, is maintained. It doesn't happen by accident. We don't fall into love. It happens intentionally. It's maintained. So we have to plan for love. If it's important to us, we have to work at it. We have to schedule time for those that we love. We have to devote energy and time to love. We have to devote resources like money to love, even counseling perhaps, if that's what it takes. We need to make it a priority. We all understand, for instance, that our cars, our automobiles, need maintenance, right? And we're going to have to shell out some big bucks because our cars are important to us. We need them, right? How much more do we need love in our lives? Let me put it to you that way, huh? A lot, I would hope. Second, love must be constant. It can't be an on-again, off-again kind of a thing. It's not, I love you when you're lovable, but rather, I love you despite the fact that sometimes you aren't very unlovable. It must be constant, through thick and thin kind of a love. Sometimes, when I'm at weddings, I explain it this way. Shallow love, or maybe the start of love, let's be honest, is when you think your partner is as sexy as Robert Redford, as smart as Bill Gates, as noble as Mahatma Gandhi, as funny as Woody Allen, and as athletic as Mike Tyson. True love, however, is when you realize that he's as sexy as Woody Allen, as smart as Mike Tyson, as funny as Gandhi, as athletic as Bill Gates, and nothing at all like Robert Redford, and yet you decide to keep your partner. That's true love. It's constant love, right? We need that. Third, love covers a multitude of sins, it says. Thanks be to God, right? Thanks be to God. Love covers a multitude of sins. The sad truth is that if you hang around in a church, or in a family, or in a community, or I imagine in a choir, you're going to hurt one another over time, aren't you? It's inevitable because we all love imperfectly, don't we? We all are flawed human beings. But if we love, then love covers a multitude of sins. We can forgive, and we can keep the relationship alive. All right, the second element of a life worth living is to show hospitality to one another, according to Peter. I mean, how simple is that, to show hospitality? And yet, it makes such a profound difference in human existence when we open our homes to one another and dine and eat together. It's the difference between having a house and making a home. A house is a bunch of 2x4s and sheetrock kind of joined together with rocks or with nails and things like that. But a home is a center of welcome and acceptance. A house is a place that we live. A home is a place of healing, which explains why we get the same word hospital out of hospitality, right? Hospital, it's healing. The third, the final element of a life worth living, according to Peter, is that we serve one another with whatever gift we have been given. All of us have a gift, says Peter. Maybe your gift is preaching. Maybe your gift is serving. Maybe your gift is singing. In other places in the Bible, it talks about encouraging or teaching or fixing things up or sewing or leading people. There are as many gifts as there are stars in the sky. It doesn't matter what your gift is, says Peter. What matters is what you do with your gift. That's the important thing. As Christians, we use our gifts to serve one another. And when we do that, two people will find joy, both the giver and the receiver, because when we share our gifts, when you all sing and you see the smiles on the faces of the congregation, for instance, you receive too, don't you? Absolutely. We find joy when we share what God has given us. That's how God has designed us. That's a wonderful thing. Told you it would get a little better. Life is short, right? But then we die. And so this weekend we're going to take some time. I hope tomorrow especially you'll take some time to ponder that reality, to ponder those who gave up their lives so that we might live. But we don't go through any of this alone, this thing called life, this short gift, this short ride we have. We go with Christ and we go with one another. And so we maintain love for one another. We forgive one another and we serve one another. And when we do this, says Peter, God will be glorified in all things through Jesus Christ. To him belong the glory and power forever and ever. Amen. And on that, we're going to invite our choir.